Okay, so this module is going to be specifically for those of you who are building the steel deck. So this is just the module about how to put on the outer frame, which is going to be slightly different than how we put on the wood frame. So before we get started, I would be remiss if I didn't go over the pros and cons of steel versus wood deck. So there are a lot of differences, and a lot of people don't consider them before they make the decision. So I'll just tell you a few of the pros and cons that we've experienced building both of these types of beds. So pro number one of a wood deck versus a steel deck is its replaceability factor. If you drop something heavy in a steel deck and you put a dent in it, it's going to fill with water and it's going to rust out, and you're kind of out of luck as far as replacing that part of your bed. You pretty much just have to get a whole new bed in order to replace that. Versus a wood deck, you break a couple boards, you can go down to the hardware store, get some new ones, replace your deck. And the other thing is you can replace your entire deck if you need to periodically with a wood deck, whereas a steel deck, you're just stuck with that for life. Secondly, a steel deck is quite a bit heavier, which if you're putting it on a diesel pickup with a ton of power, it's not going to make that much difference, but you are losing mileage and power from the extra weight of a steel deck. Third thing to consider is cost. Steel deck is almost always more expensive, mainly because you have to buy the decking material, usually diamond plate, in addition to the extra costs at powder coat or paint, because a steel deck bed has almost twice as much coverage as a wood deck bed. Because a wood deck bed, the inner frame you would sand and there wouldn't be any decking on top, whereas a steel deck, it's got a whole solid panel that they're going to have to powder coat. So consider the cost of powder coat or paint or whatever finish you're doing before you start as well. Lastly, the steel deck is just a lot more difficult of a project to fabricate, especially on this bed design, since we got number one, a lot of times the diamond plate sheets don't even come square from the factory. So if you don't have an 8-foot shear, which most people don't, you're going to have to either plaz them to square or rip them with a slitter disc into square. And then aside from that, we have the tapered tail on the back, which you're going to have to be able to fit up perfectly. So it is just a lot more difficult of a project to get it to look really professional at the end. So this is only recommended for people who are experienced fabricators and have worked with metal a lot. So consider those things before you make the decision between wood and steel deck. But if you have decided on the steel deck, we will continue next with the few differences between the wood and steel deck on the inner frame as well as the outer frame. Okay, so the first thing that's going to be different about these, and I just want to go over generally just the overall big picture of steel deck. So everything as far as building and design is going to be pretty much the same as wood deck, except for a couple things that we'll have separate modules for. So this outer frame is an example of something that's going to be a little bit different on a steel deck versus a wood deck. But if there isn't a different module with a steel deck section in it, it means that you build it exactly the same as if you were building the wood deck bed, because the models are very similar. So first thing that's going to be a little bit different than a wood deck, as you can see here, if you have your inner frame built, it probably doesn't have as many cross members as mine. And the reason for that is because if you're going to build a steel deck, we recommend that you add some extra cross members. So originally you would just have these 2-piece A's, these 4-piece B's in the center, and then your piece C's in the middle. So we're going to recommend that you add 2 cross members to the outside, and what I've done here, regardless of whether you got short bed or long bed, it's going to be the same concept. You just split the difference between your cross member here in the front side, put your other cross member in the center, same on the back half. Just split the difference between your existing cross member and the back end, put another cross member, and then do the exact same thing on this opposite side here. One thing you might run into is if your jig table brackets get in the way of where you should be putting your cross member, you can just move it in front of or behind that, because it doesn't really matter too much if it is centered. Nobody's going to see this, but you do need to have an extra cross member because you don't want to have a super long portion of your bed that doesn't have cross member underneath it, or it's going to be really susceptible to dent right there. So whatever the length of these cross members are, cut 4 more of them, weld them on the front and the back side, splitting the difference between your existing cross members in the end. And then later in another module that's going to explain something different about steel deck, which is right at the end of the build, and it's going to be called the flat bar module, we're actually going to add a center cross member. If you have a gooseneck ball, it's going to end right here This is going to be open for your gooseneck ball, and then it's going to start right there and go to the back. If you don't have a gooseneck ball, you're going to put it the entire length of the center. But we'll go over that at a later time because we can't do that until our outer frame's installed. So get this done, your extra cross members, and then we can move on to the difference on installing the outer frame from the wood deck. Okay, so for the actual installing the outer frame part, your inner frame should look like this. You should have the 4 cross members on the outside of your 2 long pieces, and then just the 2 cross members in the center for now. So when we move on to installing the outer frame, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to explain to you the difference between how the outer frame is mounted for steel deck versus wood deck, and then you're just going to go back to the wood deck module that is 5A before this and do everything the same except for this one difference that I'm about to explain. So these 2 pieces of scrap flat bar right here, if I turn like this, I have them welded right here. I just have these tack welded. These are what we call shelf jigs. I'm not going to go into detail on these right now because you can just go back to the wood deck module and it's going to explain everything about these shelf jigs, what the measurements mean, and so on. So just to give you an idea of the difference, so the height in which, so this is how the shelf jigs work. We just use it to hang it off our inner frame and then get it centered up and tack welded into place. Again, details on that will be in the other module. But just to show you the difference between wood and steel deck, so this is for a steel deck. As you can see here, I have the shelf jigs welded about a 1/4 inch below the top of this outer frame. That way there's a 1/4 inch between the top of this and the top of this. That gives us the perfect amount of space to slide in our diamond plate on here, and everything welds up nicely. Now when you go back to the wood deck module, these shelf jigs are going to be welded 1 3/4 inches below the top of your outer frame. And that's because if we're using a wood deck, which is 1.5 inch 2x6s, we need 1.5 inches of space to fit the deck in there. So the only difference between steel and wood deck as far as mounting the outer frame is just how far below the top of the inner frame we mount it. If you're doing the steel deck, you're going to go back and watch the wood deck module, and every time it says to put your inner frame 1 3/4 inches below the top of it, you're just going to do a 1/4 inch instead, just to make up for the difference in thickness of our deck material, since you're just using 1/8 inch diamond plate to deck this bed versus 1.5 inch wood to deck the wood deck bed. So go back and watch the wood deck module, do everything the same. You're just going to mount your shelf jigs a 1/4 inch below the top of the outer frame instead of 1 3/4 inches.